This is my next question. Please explain Joshua chapter 7 and the story of Achan. I don't understand why Achan's children had to be stoned to death or why that was the right thing to do. Also, where's the grace of God in that particular story? Thank you. What do you say to this, Pastor Steve?
Okay. One of the things that the Bible makes clear is that when Achan is all involved with Jericho. And so at the Battle of Jericho, what God had told the people of Israel is that they were not to touch anything that came out of that city. In verse 24 of chapter 6, it says, they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. When you look down in chapter 6, verse 17, it says, now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you by all means abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse and trouble it. But all the silver and gold and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord. And so one of the things that was happening with the city of Jericho is that everybody in it, except for Rahab and her family, were to be killed. And, Jericho fought to the death anyway, and so that's what was going to happen. But everybody in the city was going to be killed, and everything in the city, including animals, was dedicated to the Lord. It's a term that many times is translated to be under the ban. And so when God had Israel going through Canaan, there were certain places, and Jericho was one of them, that were under the ban. Everything in the city had to be destroyed, and that was as an offering to the Lord. It was considered holy. All the people, all of the animals, all of the implements, all the things that were in there were considered holy, and it was God's and God's alone. And so He wanted it all destroyed. And this is where the grace is. I don't know why He wanted it all destroyed, but I've got a good idea, and it has to do with the lifestyle of the Canaanites. The Canaanites actually, well over 600 years before. Some people would say less than that, but I think it was over 600 years before, God had been speaking to Abraham and said, I'm going to give you all of this land, the land of Canaan, and it's all going to be yours, but not yet, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And what we know about Canaanite culture is that it was one of the most depraved and corrupt cultures in all of human history. These people would have sex with anything, and they literally their wives, the men, the women, literally every year had to, basically as a tithe to their gods, become a prostitute during the year and sleep with anybody who wanted to sleep with them. And it caused all kinds of problems, including unwanted pregnancies, that kind of thing. The unwanted pregnancies, the children would be born, and they would burn them alive as an offering to their gods. And this is when you go through the things that God speaks about that the Israelis are not to follow in the book of Leviticus and in some places in Numbers. It has to do with bestiality, has to do with homosexuality, has to do with cross-dressing, has to do with all kinds of just awful stuff. And God wanted this culture wiped out. And there would be a reason for that. So we've had that kind of culture since basically the mid-'60s. And it just took from the mid-'60s to 1980 to get AIDS. And if we didn't have modern medicine, AIDS would have wiped out at least a third of the planet. At least a third of the planet. That's exactly what happened in Africa, where they didn't have a lot of the modern medicines that we have. And the grace is that I believe what God's doing is he's keeping the rest of the human race from reaping the consequences of the lifestyle of the Canaanites. One of the things, and God was selective in this. With Jericho, Jericho was to be wiped out. With Ai, and this is a problem with Achan. He's the guy that got put to death in chapter 7. With Ai, God told them that they could plunder the city, and so they were to drive these people out, and they could take from the plunder anything that they wanted. And so all Achan had to do was wait until the next battle, and what he thought he had to do to get something that he felt that he needed was take it from God. And he didn't realize who God was. Okay, so that's the grace part. I think that what God was doing was saving the Israelis and saving actually most likely the rest of humanity from a lot of the sexual diseases, the sexually transmitted diseases that would have come after 600 years of this behavior. And like I said, in my lifetime, 15 years of the behavior that we have in the United States brought us AIDS. And so you can imagine what would happen after 600 years. The other thing that you have is, as you said, at the end, in verse 25 of chapter 7, it says, "And Joshua said, 'Why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day.' So all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them." And in verse 24, it says, "Joshua, all Israel with him, took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the garment, the wedge of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that he had. They brought him to the valley of Achor, and they ended up being put to death and then burnt." One of the things that's going on here is that Achan has taken from the accursed things, or those things that were accursed and devoted is the same word in Hebrew. They've taken up the accursed things, and so now they've become part of the accursed things. And so not only Achan, but everything that he has, his donkeys, his oxen, everything that he has is now a part of the accursed things. And so that's why we're dealing with donkeys and tents and everything that Achan owns there. He infected his whole family with his sin. The other thing that you have is, it's clear in Deuteronomy 24. Let me find this here. Deuteronomy 24 in verse 16, I believe it is. Yeah, it says this: "Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin." And so you have to assume that Joshua is keeping what the Word of God has to say. Obviously, God's not going to contradict His own word. And when you see children in the passage, I'm just like you. When I see children in a passage, I immediately think of 3-year-olds. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a group of people who are accountable. And so these are adults. These are as adult children. And one of the things that you had in this kind of society is the whole family lived together, even if they were married. And so they would have an area, a little compound with all their tents and that kind of thing. And what Achan said that he did with the stuff that he stole from the Lord is that he buried it in the middle of his tent. And so, that's like me saying I stuck it under the floorboards in my living room. Everybody in my household is going to know what I'm doing at that point. Unless they're out, and that's not this culture. They're not out at work someplace. And so it's obvious that what was happening here is his children, his daughters, and his sons were in on the whole thing. They knew what Dad had done, and they didn't say anything about it. And so they're complicit in the sin. And this sin got 35 men killed when they went into Ai, because they had sinned at Jericho. The blessing of God, the protection of God wasn't on them, and 35 men were killed. These are guys who are dads and who are husbands and who are sons. And so Achan's sin didn't just affect him and his family; it affected 35 other families too. And so I don't have a lot of sympathy for Achan or even his family in this situation. Again, if they're being put to death, it's because they were in on the whole thing. And so there you go. I think that's pretty thorough.
Yeah, when you and I'm not saying they're saying this, but when people, why would a loving God send people to hell, or where's the love in that? There are times where it's not loving. That's not grace. You're dealing with a total different characteristic, time, place, issue. So
Yeah, it's judgment.
yeah, judgment. So
Yeah.
before a judge, if somebody rapes someone, that's not the time to pour out grace.
Exactly.
We're dealing with something totally different.
Yeah.
And so people attack God's. I'm not saying they're doing this, but
Right, yeah.
people attack God's character and go, well, how is that loving? And it's like, well, we're dealing with something totally different, and the grace period has been closed by their own free will choice.
Right.
And it's actually loving in the context of other people because of the 35 families that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more going on in the context.
Yeah. And so, when you're looking at the things that God says to us, there are things that are not optional. And so in that situation, again, Joshua warned them right before they went into the city, do not take from any of the stuff. And Achan decided to do it. And he specifically said, I saw these things, I wanted them, I took them, I hid them in the midst of my tent. And he didn't come up and confess it. What happened was he got called out. And so you read chapter 7, and so you know how he got called out. They were casting lots, and God kept pointing out where, which tribe, which family from which tribe, and then finally got down to Achan, and Joshua said, what have you done? And it's not until that point that Achan finally fessed up. So
God doesn't change his mind about things either. And when you read the Old Testament, you read those stories or whatever, it's grace to me because I should have died a lot of times.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
So you can see God's love as he pours it out on us in those stories.